right, so we talked about gauge. Now you understand gauge. Now you know roughly how big the barbs are on the needles. You know roughly the diameter of your hair. There's only one more thing that we need to iron out before you go needle shopping, and that is how you intend to root. For the two single strand methods that I mentioned, root a loop and cuticle aligned single strand rooting, it's very forgiving on what gauge of needle that you use because you're only grabbing one hair at a time and you are visually confirming that you have one hair at a time. You can use a 38 gauge, you can use a 40 gauge, you can have one barb, you can have 9 barbs. It really doesn't matter because it's up to you to determine that there is one hair per hair plug. 1 or 2 hairs depending on how you want to do your micro rooting. So these methods are very forgiving. However, you can't use a fork needle because it's very difficult to align that tiny little fork to your tiny piece of hair. It's really hard to see and it's going to give you a hard time. So you definitely, if you root a loop or if you do the single strand cuticle aligned rooting, you'll want a barb needle. The size doesn't really matter. Whatever size is comfortable for you to work with. Now, I will mention that large needles do have 2 disadvantages when you're doing these rooting methods. One is that a big needle will have a tendency to cut your hair. So if you're rooting loops, the needle will have a tendency, a larger needle is going to have a tendency to slice through that loop, which might be fine for what you're trying to do. I use that to root my eyebrows. I hope that it cuts the hair because I only want one hair at a time at the end of the day. But if you're trying to root quickly, or if that for whatever reason bothers you, that's something to keep in mind. A large needle is more likely to cut your hair. The other thing that you need to keep in mind is that larger needles make bigger holes, and sometimes those big barbs can cut up your vinyl. So if you look very, very closely, even under magnification, at the scalp of your doll, if you see little crumbs of vinyl sticking up out of the hole, that is damage caused by your barb. Now, most people can't see that and it doesn't bother them, so that might not be an issue. But for someone who's very detail oriented, or if you as an artist it bothers you, smaller needles are less likely to chew up your vinyl in that way. So that's something to keep in mind for the root a loop and single strand cuticle aligned micro rooting methods. Now for my stab and grabbers, you have a much more difficult decision to make in terms of which needles you use. And it's such a difficult decision that I think you probably want to try a lot of different needles until you get the results that you wanted. For my stab grabbers, you're really at the mercy of the needle, so there's a few things you need to keep in mind. Extra barbs are not your friend. The more barbs you have, the more hair it's going to grab. So the regular needles, the compact needles, these 6, 9, however many barb needles are not going to work in your favor because they're going to pick up a lot more hair than you want. So try as much as possible to stick with the crown needles, maximum of 3 barbs. There's also needles out there that have 1 barb. This is going to help you minimize the amount of hair that you're picking up. The second thing that you need to keep in mind when you're shopping for needles is the gauge of the needle determines the depth of the barb. So if I have, for example, a 38 gauge needle, my barb is probably 70 microns deep. So if I'm rooting hair, that's 20 microns diameter, that barb is going to grab more than 1 hair. It's going to grab several hairs because it's a very deep barb picking up very fine hair. So gauge is not your friend. You want to stay in the higher gauges, probably 38 minimum, when you're doing the stab and grab method. Otherwise, you're going to be putting way too much hair in your hair plugs. So I'm going to do a quick demo so that you can see what the different rooting needles look like on the stab and grab method. So the first needle we're trying is a 42 gauge crown. 3 barbs, and they're relatively small. Well, I'm just going to punch through it. And I didn't do a very good job punching through it because the entire ends didn't go through. But it looks pretty nice, right? I mean, it's, you know, 1 or 2 strands per plug. I'm going to try rooting it from the middle so I don't have that weird stubble. I told you guys I'm not a stab and grabber. We're just going to punch it around, and I'm going to try not to stab myself. Okay, then we'll inspect again. So, as you can see, those are pretty nice hair plugs, right? The hair is folded in half. So on average, there's 2 in each hair plugs, but I don't have any big, chunky, awful hair plugs. Now, let's run that same experiment again, this time with the 42 gauge regular. So the needle is the same size. The barbs are on average the same size, but I've got twice as many. So let's see what happens. We're right next to our other area. And I'm going to punch it around. And let's see what we got. Ah! These hair plugs are huge. Isn't that horrible? It's fine, actually, if your goal is not micro-rooting, but these are huge hair plugs. So like I said, the more barbs you have, the more hair it's gonna grab. And if you're trying to micro-root, hair plugs this size are unacceptable. So that's why, stab grabbers, you really wanna stay with the crown rooting needles, maximum 3 barbs. More than that, and you're gonna start getting some pretty big hair plugs. All right, so let's do another one. So this is a 43 gauge crown. So we went up a notch in the gauge. So this is a tinier needle with tinier barbs, and I've only got 1 barb per side. So let's see how that's gonna look. Another thing I should mention, the more hair you hold, the more opportunity it is for the needle to grab. So if you're really, for some reason you're stuck with a huge needle, you can mitigate to some extent how much hair your needle's gonna grab by making your lock smaller. Okay, so we're gonna go a few punches with this 43 gauge. I'm being very careful because the tinier the needle, the easier it is to break. So I'm not rooting very fast here. Now, isn't that pretty? So this is our 43 gauge. Look how tiny those hair plugs are. That's very nice. So our smaller needle, you get a much nicer result, but you have to be careful because it is very easy to break. Now, if you're just getting started in reborning and you just got your starter kit probably has this needle in it. This is a 38 gauge crown, so this needle is a lot wider than all the needles we've tried so far, but it only has 3 barbs. So let's see what you can expect when you're using a 38 gauge crown needle with the stab and grab method. This one's nice and thick, so I can actually root pretty quickly. I don't feel it bowing under my pressure. All right, let's see what we got. So this isn't too bad. It's not as nice as what we got with the 43, but it's not as bad as what we got with the 42 regular. So, you know, it's kind of in between. Like sometimes you get 1 hair, sometimes you get 8 hairs. It's just, you know, it's not amazing, but it's okay. It's doable, I guess. So there you go. So different needles yield different results using the stab and grab method. If you can, the 42 to 43 gauge needles do a really nice job I also use my 42 gauge crown needle when I'm rooting a loop, and when I'm doing single strand cuticle align rooting. That's kind of like my little favorite go-to needle at the moment. But barbs matter, gauge matters, the type of hair you're rooting matters. So once you've balanced out all of those variables, you can really control the results that you get. Now, the very last thing we're going to look at are the forked needles. Okay, here's a forked needle. I don't know if you can see it, but there is a fork split into this needle. I think it's just impossible. It's so microscopic. Okay, yeah, no, there it is. See that? Ah, there we go. That's a fork. So that's the fork on the end of the rooting needle, which is something I have to keep in mind because I need to align it to the lock of hair in order to get any hair. So I'm going to get my lock of hair. I'm going to find the direction of the fork, which I actually have a hard time doing because I can't see it. So I think it's about there. And I'm going to root through the lock. So only the very tip of this needle is grabbing hair. Now, when you're rooting, you always want to use a tool. You don't want to hold just the needle like this. It's very hard on your joints. I'm only doing it because I've gone through so many needles I didn't want to keep mounting them into the tools. Alright, so here is the hair that we rooted with the 42 gauge forked needle. So it looks pretty nice. I root it from the middle so the hair is folded in half. Every once in a while you've got some hair plugs with maybe a few more hairs than you would prefer. But, you know, it does an alright job. So fork needles are also an option for those who use the jab and grab method. Now, for those who do root a loop and the cuticle aligned single strand rooting, the forks are very difficult to work with. It's very hard to get it oriented properly if you're just grabbing one strand at a time. So definitely for those other two methods, you want to stick with barb needles. In my rooting needle sample, you'll receive one of each of my favorite kinds of rooting needles. The 38 gauge crown, the 40 gauge regular, the 42 gauge crown, 42 gauge regular, and a 42 gauge forked. So no matter what your rooting style is, one of these is surely to give you the results that you want. And just so you know, my favorite needle right now is the 42 crown. For rooting loops, it's sweet. I love it. But try them all until you find the one you like. My advanced rooting needle sampler, I'm going to swap out the 38 gauge crown needle for a 43 gauge crown needle. So this is even smaller, even easier to break, but for more detailed work and smaller holes. So you have those two options. Also, you have the option to have them cut. And if you're not sure if you need your rooting needles cut, stay tuned for my next video on rooting tools. Well, thank you so much for joining me for assessing your rooting needle needs. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Also, check out the companion blog article for all the reference tables and details and photographs and everything that just really helps to explain which rooting needles we need for which purposes. Definitely be sure to try them out. Stop by my store, CustomDollBaby.com/store, and grab your rooting needle sampler so that you can try them all out on different types of mohair or hair, human hair, mohair, on different kinds of doll kits to see which ones meet your needs. And you can also try all three rooting methods with the rooting needle sampler. So this is a really great opportunity to get familiar with rooting and find out what works best for you without having to spend too much money on needles. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel, like the video, and I will look forward to seeing you next time. Happy rooting! Bye!